Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMind Factory and welcome to this new video from the series called Modern Identity powered by Azure. In this video, I would like to talk about DevOps automation for Azure AD B2C. Because if you think that you cannot automate things within Azure AD B2C tenant, you're wrong. So that's why I prepared this video to show you more. So let's start. Magic question. Is it even possible to use DevOps practices with Azure AD B2C? And the answer is yes, of course. So let's start with Azure AD B2C tenant deployment automation. For me personally, this is the most confusing part around Azure AD B2C. If you will try to find answers over the internet, you will find many different kinds of answers and assumptions about tenant deployment automation. So that's why I decided in this video to touch on this specific element around Azure AD B2C to clarify this. So obviously, one of the options is to go to Azure portal and create B2C tenant manually. But is it possible to create such tenant with tools like Azure DevOps or GitHub? The answer is it is possible to automate creation of Azure AD B2C tenant with DevOps tools, which I mentioned. DevOps, Azure DevOps, GitHub, any other tools. However, there are some constraints, and let's talk about them in this video. So, to create Azure AD B2C tenant, we must use Azure Resource Manager API. So when you will go to the documentation and you will try to find anything about Azure AD B2C tenant creation using some APIs, you will find information that you have to use Azure Resource Manager API to do it. And now, important thing is that user impersonation scope is required, which means that user account must be used instead of service principal to create Azure AD B2C tenant. And that's really important. So every time you will try to use the standard approach, so let's say that you will create service principal in the Azure AD, then you will try to use this service principal in the Azure DevOps, in the service connection, and you will try to create new tenant, you will get the error. And this is what people see, and they are confused. So that's why I want to underline this. Yes, you can automate tenant creation. However, standard user account must be used for that. It means that in Azure DevOps, GitHub, or any other tool, we must use user account to authenticate and execute deployment script for Azure AD B2C. It means that we need user credentials. User account that is used for tenant deployment will become global administrator in the newly created Azure AD B2C tenant. So that's very important, yeah? So in this case, service principal cannot be global administrator in the newly created tenant. It has to be user account. So that's why this is like an exception. In a typical deployment scenario, obviously, you would create service principal in the Azure AD, assign specific RBAC role, and then use this service principal in the service connection in the Azure DevOps, for instance, yeah? But in this case, this is different approach. So that's why we need this user account, because this user account will become global administrator in the newly created B2C tenant. Okay, perfect. So now going further, there are automation options. So in this case, I would like to show you Bicep template for B2C tenant creation. Obviously, you can immediately ask, Daniel, what about Terraform and so on? Yes, with Terraform, you also can create Azure AD B2C tenant. The rule is exactly the same. User account is needed for that. So, as you can see, this is the Bicep template. And as you can see, obviously, we have provided some parameters to create B2C resource, like the tenant name, the location, and the country code. And with such structure in the Bicep file, in such template, we can create Azure AD B2C tenant. So in this case, we can create such template, store it in the Git repository, on GitHub, in Azure DevOps, in any other tool, and using user account, we can authenticate to Azure Resource Manager API and then deploy new Azure AD B2C tenant. Okay, next step. Azure AD B2C tenant configuration automation. So once the tenant is deployed, it's good to configure few additional things. So the previous section was about the tenant creation, but once the tenant is deployed, is created, it's basically worth to configure some elements like security controls within this tenant. And these are Identity Experience Framework configuration. So let's say that we would like to use custom policies. If you ever tried using Identity Experience Framework, you probably know that you have to create policy keys, deploy custom policies, you have to register Identity Experience Framework application, proxy Identity Experience Framework application, grant specific permissions, and so on. Conditional access policies configuration. So in every new tenant, you don't have any default conditional access policies, but maybe you want to have some templates, yes? And security controls configuration for users. So for instance, you want to restrict who can invite guest users to this B2C tenant account, or who can register applications, all the users or only application administrators. Yeah. So it's good to have this configuration also stored within the code. With PowerShell and Microsoft Graph API, we can configure Azure AD B2C tenant. And that's very important to be mentioned. So every time when we will try to configure Identity Experience Framework, conditional access policies, security controls, user settings within the tenant, we can utilize Microsoft Graph API and PowerShell scripts. And this is basically what I do to automate configuration for Azure AD B2C tenants I create. Okay, so now let's talk about configuration automation process for Azure AD B2C tenant. Let's talk about the phase one. So we have the DevOps tool like Azure DevOps, GitHub, any other DevOps tool, and we execute Azure Bicep template to create new Azure AD B2C tenant. So this is what I mentioned before. So now we want to create new Azure AD B2C tenant. Once the tenant is created, we want to register management application. Why? Because we will use this management application to configure the rest of the things in the tenant. Like for instance, to register Identity Experience Framework and proxy Identity Experience Framework applications, to deploy conditional access policies, to change the user settings, and so on. So basically, this management app registration is also done through the script. And now, once we have this management app registration created, we can apply security controls configuration. So that's the first phase. So the tenant is basically configured and ready for the further actions. So this is the phase one. Let's talk about the phase two. So in the phase two, exactly as in the phase one, we have Azure DevOps GitHub tool and we have Git repository. And we execute PowerShell script to configure Identity Experience Framework. So we have to configure Identity Experience Framework application, register proxy Identity Experience Framework application, register policy keys, set the specific permissions, scopes, and so on. So this is done by the script, basically PowerShell script using Microsoft Graph API. And once we configure Identity Experience Framework, conditional access policies templates are deployed and created. So I will show you those templates in a minute during the demo, but basically the case is that in the newly created tenant, it's good to apply conditional access policies. So that's why it's good to store those templates also in the Git repository. And those conditional access policies templates can be stored as JSON files. So it's really convenient because we can store those conditional access policies as JSON files and then use PowerShell scripts to deploy those templates to Azure AD B2C tenant. Okay, perfect. So now, once we have conditional access policies, the last step is to deploy custom policies initial templates, so XML files. Again, because of the fact that custom policies are nothing else than XML files, we can store those files in the Git repository. So once phase 1 and phase 2 are completed, tenant is ready to be used. So as you can see on the left side, we have all the custom policies deployed, and obviously you can adjust the templates. In my case, those custom policies contain conditional access mechanism. So user will be asked for MFA if the user risk is detected, for instance. And also on the right side, you can see those templates for conditional access policies. So in this case, 3 policies. So first one is all apps MFA for all users when medium or high sign-in risk, basically. So if there is a sign-in risk, medium or high, we want to ask user to use MFA. The next one is all apps MFA and password reset for all users when user risk is high. So in this case, if the user risk is high, then we will ask user to reset password and also use the MFA. And the last one, Azure Portal MFA for administrators. So every administrator will have to use MFA to access the portal. Important information is, and this you will find in my another video about the conditional access policies for Azure AD B2C, but the case is that during this deployment, a security defaults feature will be disabled for Azure AD B2C tenant because of the fact that we want to use conditional access policies. That's very important. Security defaults feature has to be disabled. Okay, perfect. So the last step, Azure AD B2C custom policies deployment automation. So even if during initial tenant creation we can deploy custom policies templates, obviously in the real world scenarios, when you work with some organizations, you will probably notice that multiple custom policies are required for multiple applications with different brandings and functionalities, flows, and so on and so on. So as I mentioned, custom policies are XML files, so those can be stored in the Git repository and modified like any other tool and any other file, sorry. So in this case, we can modify those XML files with Visual Studio Code, and we can easily store them in the Git repository. They have parameters that can be replaced during deployment. So within the custom policy XML file, you will find information about the tenant name, you will find client ID of Identity Experience Framework application, proxy Identity Experience Framework application, maybe application insights, instrumentation key, deployment mode, development mode, and so on. So basically, all of this can be injected during the deployment of custom policies. So let's look at the custom policy template. Specific values can be replaced with placeholders. So as you can see, for instance, for the tenant ID, I have this placeholder settings tenant or settings deployment mode or settings developer mode enabled or settings application insights key. So during deployment, I can replace those placeholders with specific values, obviously for specific Azure AD B2C tenant environments. During deployment, we can inject those values. This is what I mentioned. Yeah. So if we have dev environment, we can use specific parameters for development environment. If we have production environment, we can obviously inject other parameters. And if you will use Azure DevOps, for instance, probably you know that there are variable groups. So you can have different variable groups, and depending on the environment type, you can use specific environment group, extract the settings, and inject those values here in the custom policy file during deployment. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about custom policies DevOps process. So we have custom policies XML files, obviously. Yeah, those files are stored in the Git repository where we obviously can check out them, modify them, and this is like a standard process. And once we push something to Git repository with changes to custom policies, then the deployment pipeline is triggered. And as you can see above, there is this variable group I mentioned. And within this variable group, I have all parameters that are required to successfully deploy those custom policies. So you will see that, for instance, I have a management application ID, management application secret, and management application tenant ID. So this is my application that I register in the Azure AD B2C tenant to make it possible to deploy custom policies through Microsoft Graph API. And obviously you can add all other parameters like application insights key, custom policies, deployment mode, environment type, identity experience framework, app ID, and so on and so on. So those parameters will be taken from this variable group during the deployment. So obviously, using the PowerShell script, we deploy those custom policies to the Azure AD B2C tenant. Perfect. So let's dive into Microsoft Graph API here for custom policies. So basically, to deploy custom policies, you can use Microsoft Graph API. There is dedicated endpoint here, the post endpoint, which you can use to deploy custom policies. It's in beta at the moment of recording this video. I don't know where it will be officially supported, but I can assure you that this endpoint works as expected. And I use it for production deployments. So I've never seen any problems with this beta endpoint. Important fact is that policy.read-write.trust framework permission is required. So when you will register the application in your Azure AD B2C tenant to automatically deploy custom policies, this application will require to have this policy.read-write.trust framework permission. And obviously the content type for this request will be application/XML. And obviously you can find more details in the documentation for Microsoft Graph API. On the right side you can see the screenshot. Yeah, so there is the detailed explanation provided how to use this specific endpoint to deploy custom policies. One more thing, there is really helpful VS Code extension for custom policies. It's called Azure AD B2C from Azure AD B2C tools. And with this extension, it's much easier to deploy custom policies, to work with them on the local host, to replace parameters, to look into technical profiles, user journeys. Also, this specific extension has integration with application insights. So what you can do, you can track issues within your custom policies using application insights directly from the VS Code. That's really cool. So that's why I recommend using this VS Code extension for Azure AD B2C, because it will be much easier to work with custom policies. Okay, perfect. So that's about the theory. So now it's time to see it in action. Here is my Azure DevOps project, which I use to automate things around Azure AD B2C. And as I mentioned before, it can be Azure DevOps, it can be GitHub, it can be any other tool to automate things around Azure AD B2C. As you can see, I have two pipelines here. AD B2C automation, so this pipeline is responsible for creating new Azure AD B2C tenant with all the templates like custom policies templates, conditional access policies templates, and security controls like user settings configured. And the second pipeline is purely used for custom policies deployment once I change them in the Git repository. So once I modify anything around custom policies, then this pipeline will be triggered to deploy those changes. Let's start with AD B2C automation repository. And as you can see here, I have a few templates here. So basically within this repository, I have all the templates and scripts required to successfully create Azure AD B2C tenant. Under the templates folder, you can see that there is tenant creation template. And here I have Azure Bicep template, which I showed you during the presentation. This one is used to create new Azure AD B2C tenant. And I have PowerShell script to basically create this tenant using this Bicep template. Also under custom policies, you can see that I have initial custom policies templates. If I will open them, you will also notice that I have placeholders here. And basically those placeholders will be replaced during the deployment of the tenant. Under configuration scripts, I have all the PowerShell scripts required to successfully configure everything within the Azure AD B2C tenant. So here is my AD B2C tenant security controls script. So basically this script is responsible for configuring user settings, disabling security defaults because we want to use conditional access policies, and few other things. So basically this will configure tenant settings like who can register applications, who can create new tenants, who can invite people to this tenant, and so on. Under configure conditional access script here, I have the script that will deploy the conditional access policies templates that are stored under conditional access templates folder. So here, as you can see, I have all the templates stored as JSON files for conditional access policies. So for instance, this one This is the template to deploy a conditional access policy for sign-in risk levels like high, medium, require, MFA for all apps. Okay, great. So now going further, configure identity experience framework script will basically register policy keys. For identity experience framework, will register identity experience framework application, will register proxy identity experience framework application, configure all the scopes, and once we have it, then we will be able to use custom policies. To basically configure anything in the tenant and deploy custom policies and so on, we have to create this management application within the tenant. So this application will be registered with specific scopes to make it possible to, for instance, configure identity experience framework, or for instance, to deploy custom policies. So this application in the end will be used to authenticate against Microsoft Graph API. And obviously here we have custom policies deployment script. So this script will be used to deploy custom policies. And there is delete AD B2C management application, because once we deploy the tenant and tenant configuration and custom policies and everything, we want to do the cleanup. So we don't want to have this application anymore within the tenant with all those permissions, yes, because those are required only during the deployment. Perfect. So this is about the B2C automation, and obviously, as I mentioned, under library, let me show you that really quickly. You can see that I have this Azure AD B2C tenant deployment variable group. And inside this variable group, you can see that, of course, I have to provide the resource group name where this specific tenant will be deployed. The country code, location, tenant name, this is purely for the Azure AD B2C, but also subscription ID, which will be linked to this specific AD B2C tenant, and subscription tenant ID. So the current tenant where subscription that will be used with the B2C is connected. And last thing, as you can see, global admin password and global admin username. Basically, those are the credentials used to authenticate against Azure Resource Manager API to successfully deploy Azure AD B2C tenant. And this user here will become global administrator in the newly created Azure AD B2C tenant. Okay, perfect. So now let's check this another repository. So AD B2C custom policies. As you can see, again, we have some pipelines here and we have some code. So under custom policies, I have the custom policies code here. So basically those custom policies will be deployed. And what is important here is the fact that I'm using the parameters again here. And you can ask, hey Daniel, but in the previous repository you used different naming convention for parameters here. Yes, because in the previous deployment Git repository, I have only custom policies that will be initially deployed. In this repository, I have custom policies that I modify, and such notation, as you can see here, is also used by the VS Code extension for Azure AD B2C. So you can replace this parameter easily within this extension, basically. So those are the templates here, and obviously those parameters will be replaced during the deployment. So under the scripts, I have custom policies build script and custom policies deployment script. Those are PowerShell scripts. And basically in the build script, this script is responsible for updating parameter values within custom policies files. So I will inject the parameters, I will replace those placeholders with the target values, and custom policies deployment script is using this Microsoft Graph API to deploy custom policies. So this endpoint, as you remember, I mentioned this beta endpoint to deploy custom policies. So now when I will open the pipeline, you can see that in the pipeline I have two stages. This is just for the demo purpose. There is a build stage, and this build stage will build custom policies and will inject parameters and will generate the package with those custom policies. And custom policies release basically is responsible for deploying those custom policies with the right parameters from the right variable group to specific B2C tenant, like in this case, B2C tenant on dev environment. So again, if we go to the library, you will see that under AD B2C policies deployment variable group, I have all the details required to deploy those custom policies. So you can see that there is management app ID, management app secret, and management app tenant ID. So this is the application I registered with this specific permission to deploy custom policies. So that's the another application than was used during the deployment. And this application is registered in the B2C tenant with this specific permission I mentioned before. And that's why I can deploy those custom policies. And as you can see, I have all other parameters like application insights key, custom policies, deployment mode, identity experience framework app ID, and so on and so on. So those parameters will be injected during the deployment here. So let's get back to the pipelines and let me show you the automation pipeline here. So as you can see, there are two stages, create and configure. So during the create stage, what will happen, we will create Azure AD B2C tenant. Obviously, before we have to set up PowerShell modules, we will create Azure AD B2C tenant. We will wait a little bit so the tenant is initialized, is created. Then we will create Azure AD B2C management application, which will be required to authenticate against Microsoft Graph API, and this application will have specific permissions granted. Once this application is created, we will configure Azure AD B2C security controls. So that's what I mentioned before. So for instance, who can create applications, register applications in the tenant, who can invite people to this tenant, and also we will configure or disable security defaults. And once this stage is completed, there is a next stage, which is called configure. And in this stage, we have to configure identity experience framework. So again, here we use PowerShell script to configure identity experience framework. Then we configure conditional access. So those templates are deployed, JSON templates I showed you, yeah. And as you can see here, we also deploy those custom policies, those templates that will be used. And obviously we have to delete this Azure AD B2C management application with all those permissions because we will not use it anymore. Like a separate application will be used to deploy something to the Azure AD B2C tenant. And when it comes to custom policies, which I will show you in a minute. So if I get back to my pipelines, in the next pipeline, so custom policies release here, you can see that there are two stages: build Azure AD B2C policies and release custom policies. And basically those are for dev environment. So here I'm building custom policies, I'm injecting the parameters from the variable group, and then in the next stage I'm deploying those custom policies to the Azure AD B2C. Okay, perfect. So now let's see what is happening in this newly created and configured Azure AD B2C tenant. Here is my newly created and configured Azure AD B2C pipelines. So I created it and configured it using the scripts and pipelines I showed you in the Azure DevOps. And as you can see, under Identity Experience Framework, I have all the custom policies deployed. Under Policy Keys, I have all required policy keys. Under App Registrations, when I will switch to all applications, you can see that there is Proxy Identity Experience Framework application, Identity Experience Framework application. So those applications were created automatically using my script. And also you can see that there is this App AD B2C Custom Policies Automation application. This one was created manually by me. As you remember, I mentioned that there is specific permission required to deploy custom policies. So as you can see under API permissions, I have policy.readwrite.trust framework permission. With this permission, I can deploy custom policies using Microsoft Graph API. Perfect. So if I go to conditional access policies, you will also see that in this specific section, I have all three templates I defined in my repository as JSON files. Those conditional access policies are in the report only mode. You can enable them and adjust them. So again, in the JSON file, we can obviously change this behavior, but I always recommend to deploy those templates in the report only mode first and then adjust them manually to make sure that you will not lock out yourself. Perfect. So once we have everything configured, we can just start using this Azure AD B2C tenant. Okay, perfect. Last thing, you probably want to ask if I can share those scripts with you. Unfortunately not, because those are used in the commercial solutions, but I hope that you found this video interesting and helpful. So thank you so much for watching and see you in the next videos.